The days following the visit from Harriet's sisters and Edward Wickham settled back into their usual tempo. Harriet spent her mornings in the garden, cataloguing new blossoms and carefully noting the weather patterns. Her afternoons were devoted to the small library upstairs, where stacks of books and pressed flowers bore witness to her botanical obsession. Life, for her, had returned to its intimate routine. Yet, every now and then, her mother's words drifted back to her. "You could have said more." Harriet often mulled over the phrase, unable to quite parse its meaning. More of what? She wondered, as she scribbled her notes. I thanked him. I even called him Edward, as he requested. What else could she possibly have wanted me to say? Her thoughts spiraled from time to time, but she could never arrive at an answer that aided her. For Harriet, words were tools to convey facts, observations, and precise meanings, not abstract hopes or unspoken sentiments. One warm afternoon, Agnes interrupted Harriet's peaceful day, pulling her away from her observations of a particularly striking bee on a foxglove. "Come along, Harriet," Agnes insisted, brushing soil from her daughter's hands with a look of mild disapproval. "We're going to the village. There are errands to run, and you've spent enough time hidden away." Harriet complied reluctantly, dusting the garden debris off her skirt. Trips to the village often exhausted her, not for their physical demands, but for the social encounters they inevitably brought. As she predicted, their walk through the bustling market square brought them face to face with numerous acquaintances, all eager to comment on Harriet's prolonged absence from society. "Harriet, how you've grown!" exclaimed Mrs. Trembleton, the miller's wife, with an overly bright smile. "Still living at home, are we, and no suitor yet?" She let out a laugh so exaggerated it bordered on the absurd. Then, Mrs. Collins, the local tailor, joined the congregation, her voice exuding concern veiled in judgment. "Have you been unwell, my dear? I don't believe I've seen you since Christmas." Each question, though framed as friendly inquiry, felt like a small needle prick to Harriet, who responded politely but tersely. Agnes, meanwhile, maintained a gracious demeanour, smoothing over the awkwardness with practised ease. It was during one such encounter that Mrs. Albright, the baker's wife, leaned closer and said in a hushed tone, "Have you heard of the ball to be held next week? The village is all aflutter with news of it. It's being held to bid farewell to our dear pastor before he departs to further his career up north in York." Agnes drew back, her eyes widening in surprise. "A ball? Why, this is the first I am hearing of it." "Well," Mrs. Albright continued, "it promises to be a most splendid affair. No doubt there will be many agreeable gentlemen for our dear Harriet to encounter." Harriet's heart sank slightly at the mention of the ball. Balls were loud, crowded, and filled with unwritten rules she always seemed to fumble. Agnes, however, was already energized by the news. "Come, Harriet," she said briskly, steering her daughter into the nearest ribbon shop. "We must make haste in beginning our arrangements." In the small, fragrant shop, Agnes rifled through bolts of fabric and spools of ribbon, holding up various colours against Harriet's complexion with a critical eye. "Edward Wickham will surely attend the ball," Agnes said casually as she examined a pale blue ribbon against Harriet's grey eyes. Harriet shifted slightly under her mother's scrutiny, her gaze fixed on a neatly organised shelf of thread. "Do you believe so?" she asked, her tone neutral. Agnes lowered the ribbon with a faint smile. "Why wouldn't he? A ball is an excellent occasion for him to reacquaint himself with old friends." Harriet glanced at her mother, her expression thoughtful but dismissive. "I suppose," she murmured, returning her attention to the threads. Agnes sighed as she unravelled another spool of pink ribbon. "Harriet, it wouldn't hurt to be a little more forthcoming with Edward. He's always thought well of you, and I dare say he's matured into quite a fine gentleman." Harriet frowned slightly, unsure of what her mother expected of her. "I'll be polite, as always." Agnes opened her mouth as if to press the point further, but quickly thought better of it. Conversations like this always seemed to go in circles, and she hadn't the energy to pursue it today. She set the ribbon back on the counter and turned her attention to the next item on the shelf. As they made their way back home, their arms laden with parcels, they crossed paths with a well-dressed gentleman carrying a bundle of cream floral envelopes. He paused when he saw them, and Harriet froze as recognition dawned. "Miss Grant," Mr. Crawford said pleasantly, tipping his hat, "I was just making my way to your house." Agnes studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I don't believe we've met. Are you—" "Mr. Crawford," he said with a bow. "I had the honour of sharing tea with Miss Grant. We met at the Red Fern Tea Room." Agnes blinked in surprise but recovered quickly. "Ah, I see. How lovely to meet you, Mr. Crawford." Harriet, meanwhile, felt her cheeks flush. She nodded stiffly. Her unease from their previous encounter began to stir anew. Mr. Crawford handed over an envelope. "I'm assisting my godfather, the pastor, with the invitations for the ball. I do hope you'll both attend." Agnes beamed. "How kind! We wouldn't dream of missing it." Before Mr. Crawford could leave, Agnes stopped him. "Would it be possible to extend the invitation to a few more? My daughters and perhaps their husbands, of course, but also Edward Wickham, a dear family friend who's in the area, would be most pleased to receive an invitation." At the mention of Edward's name, Mr. Crawford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his smile becoming tighter. "Edward Wickham, you say? How is it you know him?" "Oh, well, he grew up near us and was like one of our own. Such a fine young man," Agnes explained. Mr. Crawford hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "I see. Well, of course they're welcome to attend. The more, the merrier." Agnes caught the faintest coolness in his voice, but before she could dwell on it, Mr. Crawford tipped his hat again and took his leave. She clutched the invitation excitedly. "Finally. Now, we must ensure you're properly prepared for the ball, Harriet." Harriet glanced after Mr. Crawford, her discomfort ebbing slightly as she realised he didn't seem to bear her any ill will. If anything, his kindness reassured her, and the thought of seeing him at the ball left her feeling both anxious and surprisingly eager.